My name is Natalie Grace Foster, and I'm 27 years old. It was a Tuesday evening when the call came, the kind of call you think happens to other people until it's your turn. I was halfway through grading a stack of kindergarten art projects, red pen in one hand, tea cooling on the windowsill. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me swipe. Ms. Foster? The voice was calm, measured. A police officer, I realized, a heartbeat later. And then the words hit. Your grandparents. There's been an accident. The rest blurred, phrases like drunk driver, intersection, died instantly. My pen rolled off the table and hit the floor. I don't remember picking it up. 6 weeks ago, I'd been an ordinary kindergarten teacher living paycheck to paycheck in a one-bedroom apartment with secondhand furniture and too many plants. My grandparents, Elizabeth and Harold Alexander, had been my constants, the two people who never treated me like an afterthought, and now, in the space of one phone call, they were gone. The funeral was 3 days later. Rain had soaked the cemetery lawn, and every time someone shifted, their shoes squelched against the mud. My parents, Richard and Diane, took charge, not out of grief, but out of habit, barking at the funeral director about floral arrangements and cost per head like they were negotiating a corporate contract. Jason, my 25-year-old brother, flew in from California and spent most of the service scrolling his phone. Aunt Pam dabbed at her eyes for the cameras, her husband, Uncle Steve, standing awkwardly behind her like a shadow. I noticed, not for the first time, that none of them had visited my grandparents in years. Yet here they were, performing grief like a play they'd rehearsed. I tried to focus on the coffin instead, willing myself to remember the warmth of Sunday dinners, Grandpa's off-key whistling in the kitchen, the way Grandma always slipped me extra dessert when she thought no one was looking. But the air around me felt heavy, like a storm was brewing beneath the black umbrellas. 2 weeks later, the real storm arrived. Matthew Goldstein, my grandparents' attorney, a name I'd heard them speak with respect, called and asked me to come to his office for the reading of the will. "Bring your immediate family," he said. His voice had a weight to it, as though he already knew this meeting wouldn't end quietly. The morning of the reading was gray and drizzly, the sky low and colorless. I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching the old umbrella Grandma had insisted I keep in my car for emergencies. The building was a converted Victorian with creaking wooden floors and the faint smell of lemon polish. The kind of place where important decisions feel heavier simply because of the walls that hold them. Matthew greeted me in the foyer, silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Natalie," he said quietly. "Elizabeth and Harold were extraordinary people. I'll miss our chess games and her lemon bars." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and I felt my throat tighten. Before I could reply, the glass door banged open. My father strode in first, adjusting his expensive watch like he was already late for something more important. My mother followed, designer handbag slung over her arm, wearing perfume that seemed to coat the air between us. Jason swaggered in behind them, sunglasses on despite the rain, shirt half untucked. Aunt Pam's voice carried from the doorway as she complained loudly to someone on the phone. Uncle Steve brought up the rear, eyes sliding away from mine. We gathered around a long oak table in Matthew's conference room, the chairs arranged like opposing armies. My father claimed one end, my mother beside him. Jason sprawled in the chair next to her. I sat near Matthew at the head, not for position, but for proximity, a quiet instinct telling me I'd need an ally today. Matthew adjusted his glasses, a slow, deliberate motion. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to note that your parents were of sound mind when they updated their will last year. Their wishes were clear and thoroughly documented." My father snorted. "We all know how this goes. Dad built the business. I'm his son. Let's just read it." Matthew's voice didn't change as he opened a leather portfolio and began. Legal language filled the room, thick and formal, until he reached the part that made everyone stop breathing. "We hereby bequeath our entire estate, all cash assets, investments, real estate holdings, and our 25% ownership stake in Alexander Logistics to our beloved granddaughter, Natalie Grace Foster." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Jason's sunglasses slid down his nose as he blinked. My mother's painted lips parted, then pressed thin. My father's chair scraped back as he stood so fast it toppled over. "Let me see that," he barked, yanking the will from Matthew's hands. But Matthew wasn't finished. We make no provision for our son, Richard Alexander, our daughter-in-law, Diane Alexander, our grandson, Jason Alexander, our daughter, Pamela Davis, or our son-in-law, Stephen Davis, as we have provided for them during our lifetime. Our reasons have been made clear to our attorney. No one spoke. Then my father slammed the papers onto the table. This is ridiculous. $26 million to a kindergarten teacher? She wouldn't know the first thing about... Matthew lifted a hand. There's more. He pressed a button on the remote, and a flat screen on the wall flickered to life. My grandparents appeared, sitting side by side on their living room sofa. Seeing them alive again, even on a screen, knocked the breath out of me. If you're watching this, Grandpa began, it means we're gone, and it also means we have some explaining to do. And that was when the room began to change. Grandpa Harold's voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it, as if he'd rehearsed these words 100 times. We want to make sure there's no confusion about why we've made these decisions, he said. Grandma Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped. Richard, Pam, we love you as our children, but we've been deeply disappointed in the values you've embraced and passed down to your own children, with the exception of Natalie. Jason made a noise, somewhere between a scoff and a laugh, but it died quickly under my grandmother's gaze, even in video form. For the next few minutes, they laid it bare. Missed birthdays, family events skipped for vacations or business trips, visits that always seemed to include a request for money, loans never repaid, contempt for their modest lifestyle, a pattern of taking, never giving. Grandpa's jaw tightened. The business we built was never about amassing wealth. It was about creating stability for our family and opportunity for our employees. We built it through hard work, integrity, and fairness. Natalie has lived those values without being asked. Grandma added softly, she visits because she cares, not because she wants something. She chose a career helping children despite the low pay. We trust her to be a good steward of what we've built, to honor our legacy, not squander it. The video ended on their faces, proud, resolute, and utterly certain. The screen went black. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Then my father erupted. Absolute garbage. They were clearly senile. We'll contest this. No judge will uphold it. They were tested, Matthew replied calmly. Multiple doctors confirmed their mental capacity. They documented the reasoning for this decision extensively. Contesting will be difficult. My mother's tone shifted to something almost sweet, the voice she used at dinner parties. Natalie, darling, you know this isn't right. Your grandparents were confused. This money belongs to the whole family. You'll share it with us, won't you? All eyes turned to me. The sudden pressure made my throat go dry. I need to think about this, I stammered. Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table like a poker player with a winning hand. There's nothing to think about. That money should be split evenly, or at least managed by someone who knows what they're doing. He didn't bother hiding the fact that someone meant him or my father. Aunt Pam's face was blotchy with anger. What did you do to them, Natalie? How did you manipulate them into this? I began, but Matthew's hand touched my arm under the table, a silent reminder that I didn't have to defend myself right now. You don't have to decide today, he said aloud. Take time to process. My office will handle all immediate estate matters. He slid a thick envelope toward me. Keys to their house, relevant documents, contact information for financial advisors. Keep them safe. The rest of the meeting devolved into sharp voices, whispered side conversations, and the scraping of chairs as people shifted restlessly. Matthew eventually had to end it, citing another appointment. We filtered out into the rain. My father caught my arm hard enough to make my fingers tingle. This discussion is not over. Come to our house tonight at 6. We'll sort this out as a family. It wasn't an invitation. By the time I got into my car, the envelope sat like a brick in my lap. My parents pulled out of the lot in their black sedan without looking back. Jason sped off in his leased sports car, music blaring. I stayed there, windshield wipers ticking against the drizzle, wondering how an inheritance meant to be a blessing could already feel like a curse. Their house looked even bigger in the rain. 5,000 square feet of granite and glass, perched at the top of a perfectly manicured drive, designed to impress from the curb, but cold as a hotel lobby inside. I pulled in at 5:45, because showing up late would only give them more ammunition. The envelope from Matthew sat on the passenger seat. edges softening where my thumb had been rubbing it all day. I took it with me. Inside, they were already waiting in the formal living room, a room so pristine it felt staged. All white couches and chrome surfaces, like no one ever sat there. My father stood by the fireplace with a tumbler of scotch. My mother perched on the edge of an angular designer chair. Jason sprawled across the sofa, phone in hand. Aunt Pam paced in short, impatient strides, while Uncle Steve stood by the window, half turned away like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Sit down," my father said. It wasn't a suggestion. I chose a chair closest to the door. Call it instinct. He started in his business negotiation voice, the one that smoothed over hostility with false civility. "Let's be reasonable. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you." My mother leaned forward, her tone dipped in honey. "Sweetheart, managing wealth is complicated. Your father has the experience to handle this properly. You'll still get a nice portion, enough for a down payment on a real house instead of that apartment." Jason didn't wait for his turn. 10%, he said. "That's what they're offering. Over $2 million. More than enough for a teacher." He said teacher like it was an insult. "I need at least 5, he added quickly. "For my crypto exchange platform, it's going to be huge." I almost laughed. Jason had been about to be huge for years. App ideas that collapsed after a few months. Schemes that burned through other people's money. Aunt Pam cut in. "The house should go to us. We have 3 kids to think about. That neighborhood would give them better schools." Her voice rose slightly, as though sheer volume could make it true. I looked at each of them in turn, waiting for someone to mention my grandparents' wishes. No one did. When guilt didn't work, my mother switched to accusation. "After everything we've done for you, private school, summer camps, braces, this is how you repay us?" I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste copper. My father's voice sharpened. "We're not asking, Natalie. We're telling you. Either you sign the transfer documents voluntarily, or we contest the will. We'll drag every detail of your relationship with them into court. How often you visited, what you said about us when we weren't there. It'll get ugly." Somewhere in my chest, something clicked. I remembered Grandpa, crouched beside me on the playground when I was 8, telling me, "No one can take your dignity unless you hand it over." I sat up straighter. "I'm not signing." The room stilled for a heartbeat, then erupted. My mother's voice went shrill. Jason cursed. Aunt Pam demanded to know how I could be so selfish. My father slammed his glass down hard enough to crack it. "You have a choice, Kiss," he said, pointing at me like he was closing a deal. "Sign and remain part of this family, or take your inheritance and consider yourself disowned. You can't have both." I looked around the room for any flicker of softness. There was none. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, "but I have to respect Grandma and Grandpa's wishes." His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then get out of my house." I opened my mouth to remind him I didn't live there, but he was already smirking. "We own your apartment building through an investment company. Consider your lease terminated. You have 30 minutes to pack your essentials before the locks are changed." Jason leaned back, grinning. "Better hurry, sis. That $26 million won't keep you warm tonight." 30 minutes is not enough time to dismantle a life. I drove back to my apartment with my father following in his sedan like some kind of personal escort. The rain had turned into a cold mist, beating on my jacket as I fumbled with the keys. He stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, watching like a guard, making sure I didn't steal anything. I moved on autopilot, duffel bag, backpack, whatever boxes I could find under the sink. I grabbed clothes, toiletries, my passport, and the file folder with my birth certificate and other important papers. I snatched framed photos from my nightstand, the quilt my grandmother had made, my laptop. Every object I touched carried the same heavy question. Am I leaving this behind forever? Downstairs, I could hear my mother's voice on the phone with a real estate agent, her tone businesslike. "Yes, we'll want the grandparents' house listed immediately after probate clears. It's a prime neighborhood." They weren't even pretending this was about family anymore. My father's shadow filled the bedroom doorway. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "your mother and I were going to divorce before she got pregnant with you. You were the obligation that kept us together." It landed like a slap, but his expression didn't change. From the hall, my mother called up, "Don't forget to take anything sentimental. It's going to charity tomorrow." Jason appeared next, leaning against the doorframe, grinning like a kid who'd just broken a toy. "You'll regret this, sis." That money will run out faster than you think, and when it does, you'll come crawling back. I stuffed the last of my things into the bag and zipped it closed. Is that everything? My father asked, checking his watch. I'll come back for the rest later, I said. He laughed. There won't be a later. That was it. The end of any illusion that I'd been wanted in this family for something other than utility. I hauled my bags down the stairs alone. At the front door, they stood in a row. My parents, Jason, Aunt Pam, Uncle Steve, each with a different expression. Triumph, irritation, detachment. You might have money now, my mother said, but family is forever. You'll realize what you've thrown away. I'm not the one throwing it away, I replied quietly. The door slammed behind me with a finality that left my ears ringing. I stood by my car, cold seeping through my coat, bags at my feet. The apartment I thought was mine wasn't. My so-called family had just erased me from their lives. I slid behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the mist on the windshield. Then my gaze fell on the envelope from Matthew, still on the passenger seat. Inside, on top of a stack of documents, was a familiar rabbit-shaped keychain. The one my grandmother had carried for years. The keys to their house. My house now. I started the engine. The drive to my grandparents' neighborhood took 20 minutes, but each mile felt like stepping deeper into another life. Their street was quiet, lined with maple trees just starting to turn, leaves scattered across the wet pavement. The porch light was on, probably set to the same timer Grandpa had programmed years ago. The sight of it made my chest ache. I sat in the driveway longer than I meant to, fingers curled around the rabbit keychain. I wasn't sure which felt harder, walking into the house without them or admitting to myself that it was now mine. The key slid into the lock easily. When the door swung open, the air hit me first, a faint blend of my grandmother's lemon verbena potpourri and the wood polish Grandpa used every Sunday on the dining table. The smell was so familiar, it almost made me call out, "I'm here," the way I always had. But the silence answered back. I flipped on the entry light. Everything looked exactly as I'd last seen it. The hall mirror angled just so, the umbrella stand by the door, the framed photos of cousins and long-ago vacations. My grandparents' coats still hung on the hooks, ready for walks they'd never take again. I wandered through the rooms in slow motion. In the kitchen, a ceramic cookie jar, shaped like a hen, still sat on the counter. The calendar on the wall showed the month they'd died, with a dinner date circled in Grandma's looping handwriting. Sunday with Natalie. Upstairs, I paused outside the master bedroom, hand on the doorknob. I couldn't open it yet. Not tonight. Instead, I went to the guest room, my room. The bed was neatly made, a stack of fresh towels folded on the dresser. A novel I'd been reading on my last visit still lay on the nightstand, bookmark in place. The thought that she'd prepared the room for me, expecting I'd be back soon, unraveled me. I sat on the bed, clutching the quilt she'd made me when I left for college, and let the tears come. They weren't quiet tears. They were the kind that shake your whole body, the kind you can't stop once they start. At some point, exhaustion won. I fell asleep fully clothed, the quilt wrapped tight around me. When I woke, morning light was streaming through the curtains. The house felt different in daylight, less haunted, more like it was waiting for something, or maybe for someone. My phone buzzed. Dozens of missed calls and texts from my parents, most alternating between threats and sugar-coated pleas. Then one from Jason, short and sharp. Enjoy the big, empty house while you can. Not for long. A cold ripple went through me. It didn't sound like bluster. It sounded like a promise. I forwarded the message to Matthew. His reply came within seconds. Stay put. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, the low hum of an engine announced Matthew's arrival. I peeked through the lace curtain and saw him climbing out of a silver sedan, a cardboard drink tray in one hand, his leather briefcase in the other. When I opened the door, the morning air rushed in, damp and sharp, carrying the scent of wet leaves. First things first, he said, handing me a coffee. 2 creams, no sugar, right? I nodded, surprised he remembered. We sat at the breakfast nook where my grandparents and I had shared countless Sunday pancakes. The house still felt too quiet, but Matthew's presence gave it weight again, like the air had shifted towards something solid. Your family has already contacted 3 attorneys about contesting the will, he began, flipping open the brass clasps on his briefcase. I anticipated this, and we're ready. They'll find it's not as easy as they think. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth sink into my fingers. They kicked me out last night, I admitted. Turns out my father owns my apartment building through one of his companies. Matthew's mouth tightened. Typical Richard. Use leverage to force compliance. He reached into the briefcase again and slid a manila folder across the table. What he doesn't know is that your grandparents provided for exactly this scenario. Inside was a property deed. A small cottage about 20 minutes from here, Matthew explained. Your grandmother bought it 5 years ago in a separate trust, under your name. No one else knows it exists. Relief rushed through me, mingled with something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or the bittersweet sting of realizing just how far ahead my grandparents had been thinking. But there was also a prick of defiance. I'm not ready to run off and hide, I said. Not while they're circling. A small smile tugged at the corner of Matthew's mouth. I thought you might say that, and you're not alone in this. Before I could ask what he meant, there was a knock at the back door. 2 firm raps, a pause, then one more. Matthew glanced toward the sound. That'll be Carlos. Carlos? Carlos Ramirez, your grandparents' estate manager, lived in the guest house for 15 years. I opened the door to find a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, holding his cap in both hands. His eyes were warm but alert, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. Miss Natalie, he said, voice low but steady, I'm sorry for your loss. They were good people, the best I ever worked for. Thank you, I said, and meant it. I saw your car this morning, he went on, and wanted to check if you needed anything. Mr. Harold and Mrs. Elizabeth asked me to look out for you should anything happen. That simple kindness cracked something in me. Not the grief this time, but the first spark of hope I'd felt since the will reading. Carlos stepped into the kitchen like he'd been doing it for years, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged here. He set his cap on the counter, glanced around, and then looked directly at me. They came here, he said simply. I frowned. Who? Your father, your brother. A couple of days after the funeral, when no one else was around, I was working on the north property line, pruning the hedge. They didn't know I could see the security feed from my phone. Matthew leaned forward. What did they take? Carlos's expression didn't change. Jewelry, watches, some electronics, a few things from the study that looked like documents. I felt my stomach twist. You're sure? He gave a short nod. We've got it all on video, every minute, different angles. I'd forgotten my father had installed a security system for my grandparents years ago, supposedly for their protection. Carlos seemed to read my thoughts. Mr. Harold didn't trust the old setup anymore. Last year, he had me replace it. Full coverage, no blind spots. Records to the cloud. Matthew's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. That footage will be useful. Carlos turned to me again, his voice gentler. They knew this day might come. Mr. Harold and Mrs. Elizabeth didn't just leave you the house. They left you the truth. I blinked. The truth? Follow me. He led us down the hallway to the small study my grandmother used. The air in there smelled faintly of lavender and paper, a comforting mix, like a library tucked inside a home. A wall of built-in shelves lined one side, filled with hardcovers, family photos, and an entire section of leather-bound journals, each one labeled with a year. Carlos reached for a volume near the center and handed it to me. She wrote everything down, every visit, every conversation. I opened it to a random page and saw her neat, looping handwriting. May 15th. Richard visited today for the first time in 7 months. No questions about our health. Pitched a cryptocurrency investment, said it required $250,000. When Harold refused, Richard accused us of preferring Natalie and called us naive, left without finishing his coffee. My throat tightened. Further down the page, a second entry. Natalie visited Sunday, brought lemon muffins, helped Harold in the garden, talked about her students, stayed for dinner, did not mention money. The contrast between the two entries hit harder than any accusation could. Carlos rested a hand on the shelf. There are 30 years of these, Miss Natalie. They tell the whole story. Matthew's voice was calm, but edged with something sharper. Your grandparents didn't just leave an estate. They left a record, enough to shut down any claim your family might try to make. I closed the journal, the leather cool under my fingertips. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than loss. I felt the beginnings of a fight I might actually win. The first knock came barely 20 minutes after Carlos showed us the journals. It was brisk, 3 raps in quick succession. When I opened the door, Dorothy Reynolds stood there, my grandparents' housekeeper for over 2 decades. She wore a neat cardigan and sensible shoes, her hair pulled back in the same bun I remembered from childhood. "Oh, my girl," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled faintly of flour and soap. "You look just like Elizabeth did when she was young." Her voice wavered. She was so proud of you. Before I could answer, she was bustling into the kitchen, setting down a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel. "Food first, then talk. That's how your grandmother did it." As if on cue, the doorbell rang again. Rosa Martinez stepped in, all tailored confidence and warm eyes. She'd been my grandparents' business partner for years, co-running Alexander Logistics after they stepped back from day-to-day operations. She carried a laptop bag and a stack of binders. "Matthew filled me in," she said, her handshake firm. "I'm here to make sure the company stays exactly how your grandparents wanted it, and to help you understand the business if you want to be involved." Another knock. This time it was George Patel, the family's investment advisor. He was soft-spoken, almost scholarly, with a leather portfolio under his arm. "Your grandparents planned everything meticulously," he told me as he laid out charts on the dining room table. "No loopholes, no blind spots, but your family will try anyway." The front door seemed to open every few minutes after that. Sarah Johnson, the next-door neighbor who'd known me since I was 5, brought a tin of shortbread cookies and stories of my grandparents organizing block parties. An older couple from the local community center arrived with photographs from charity events my grandparents had quietly funded. Each new arrival brought not just food or documents, but a piece of the puzzle, stories that reinforced who my grandparents were and how deliberately they'd chosen me. Matthew stood at the head of the dining table, coordinating quietly, sliding documents into labeled folders, his calm presence anchoring the room. Carlos moved through the house like a sentry, keeping an eye on the driveway from the front windows. Dorothy kept the coffee pot full, pressing steaming mugs into everyone's hands. By early afternoon, the table was covered. Legal files, financial statements, business records, printouts from the security cameras, and, at the center, a small stack of my grandmother's journals, open to pages that made their priorities unmistakable. It felt like a war room, but instead of mercenaries, my allies were people who had loved Elizabeth and Harold for who they were, not what they owned. For the first time since all this began, I didn't feel alone in the house. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when my phone buzzed again. I'd been in the study with Carlos, carefully slipping one of the journals back into place when the screen lit up with Jason's name. The message was short, but it made my fingers tighten around the phone. "Dad, Mom, Aunt Pam, Uncle Steve, and I will be at the house tomorrow at 10 a.m. to collect what rightfully belongs to us. Better not try to stop us, or things will get ugly." I walked straight to the dining room and set the phone in front of Matthew. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "This," he said, "crosses into criminal threat territory, and it means we move to the next step." "What next step?" I asked. "The final part of your grandparents' plan." His tone was so matter-of-fact that the words took a moment to sink in. "You mean, they actually planned for this?" Matthew gave a dry, humorless smile. "Natalie, your grandparents knew your father and the others would never accept their decision. They assumed intimidation, manipulation, and even illegal entry were possible. They prepared a contingency, one that puts you in the strongest position tomorrow." He pulled his phone from his pocket and began making calls. Short, efficient conversations, each ending with, "Tomorrow morning, 10 sharp." From the kitchen, Dorothy's voice floated in. "I'll be here early to make breakfast for everyone. People think better when they're fed." Rosa tapped the lid of her laptop. "I'll bring the full financial documentation, every dollar accounted for." Carlos crossed his arms, positioning himself near the front window again. "And I'll be by the door when they arrive." I stood there, looking around at the people who'd filled this house with movement and purpose in just one day. The same house that had felt like a tomb the night before now felt defended. Still, a small knot of dread twisted in my stomach. My family had already proven they could turn cruel in a heartbeat. Tomorrow they'd walk in expecting to bulldoze me. And for the first time I thought, maybe they'd find they weren't the only ones capable of a fight. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. My father's cold stare, my mother's thin smile, Jason's smirk. I'd wake up with my fists clenched and my jaw aching. By 6:30 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely. The house was still, but there was a subtle hum under the silence, like the place itself knew something was about to happen. At 8 tomorrow, Matthew arrived, 2 travel mugs of coffee in one hand, a thick folder tucked under his arm. "Restraining orders," he said, setting the folder on the table. "Also, cease and desist letters addressing the threats Jason made. We'll be ready on both the legal and personal fronts." Dorothy came next, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee trailing in with her. She moved through the kitchen like she owned it, clattering pans, humming to herself, the kind of comforting domestic noise that made the house feel less like a battleground. At 8:45, Rosa walked in, laptop under one arm, a slim briefcase under the other. "Every cent your grandparents left is documented," she said, setting up at the dining table. "If they try to claim mismanagement, we'll bury them in proof." Carlos checked the locks on every door, then stationed himself by the front entrance. His calm was almost unnerving, like a soldier who'd done this before. "If they arrive early," he said, "I'll make sure they wait until we're ready for them." By 9:30, the house was no longer quiet. People were coming and going from the kitchen, the printer in the office whirred, legal pads filled with notes. Even the air seemed charged, every sound sharp against it. The tick of the clock, the creak of a floorboard, the faint rumble of distant traffic. Then, at 9:45, Carlos glanced out the window and said simply, "They're here." Through the lace curtain I saw them. My father's black sedan, my mother's white SUV, Aunt Pam and Uncle Steve's bright red convertible, and Jason's impractical sports car. One after another they pulled into the drive, their cars glinting wet from last night's rain. "They're early," Matthew murmured, trying to catch us off guard. I took a slow breath and straightened my shoulders. Let them. The pounding started before the doorbell. 3 heavy thuds that rattled the glass and the side lights, followed by the sharp buzz of the bell being pressed twice in quick succession. Carlos moved first. He opened the door just wide enough to fill the frame with his shoulders. "Miss Natalie is expecting you," he said evenly. "Come in." They filed inside, wet shoes clicking against the polished wood. My father at the front, his gaze sweeping the room like a man assessing a property he intends to buy. My mother followed, lips pressed in a thin, disapproving line. Jason lingered just far enough back to make it look casual, while Aunt Pam's eyes darted from the art on the walls to the stack of papers on the dining table. Uncle Steve trailed behind, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed somewhere around the floor. Their steps faltered when they saw the living room. I stood in the center, Matthew slightly behind my right shoulder, the long oak table flanked by Rosa with her laptop open, George Patel with a neat stack of financial records, and Dorothy at the far end, pouring coffee into china cups like she was hosting Sunday brunch instead of a war council. The air shifted again when the next wave of arrivals stepped through the back door. Judge Robert Henderson, tall, silver-haired, carrying the gravity of decades on the bench. Beside him, Police Chief Maria Williams, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. Last came Thomas Jang, my grandparents' financial advisor, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. My father's face drained a shade paler. He recovered quickly, pasting on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Robert," he said, voice oily. "What a surprise." The judge's reply was measured, but cold. "I'm here at the request of Harold and Elizabeth Alexander, through their attorney, to act as an impartial witness to any family disputes over their estate." My mother's tone sharpened. "This is a private matter. Why is law enforcement here?" Chief Williams' smile was faint, almost polite. "I'm here as a friend of the Alexanders, unless a crime occurs, in which case I'd be here in my official capacity." The words landed like a line drawn across the floor. Even Jason stopped fidgeting. From my spot in the center of the room, I felt something click into place. This wasn't just me versus them anymore. This was a line of people, solid and unshakable, standing between my grandparents' wishes and my family's entitlement. And for the first time, I wanted them to try something. My father tried to seize the momentum before anyone else could speak. "Let's not waste time," he said, turning toward me as though the others weren't even there. "Natalie, we're here to resolve this. Quietly. You know as well as I do." "Richard," Thomas Jang interrupted, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "Before you go any further, I think you should see something." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder, sliding it across the table toward Matthew. Matthew didn't touch it, Instead, he angled it toward my father. "These," Thomas said evenly, "are records of every attempt you've made over the last 20 years to access your parents' assets without their consent. Unauthorized transfer attempts. Forged signatures. The petition to have your mother declared incompetent last year after she refused to fund Jason's cryptocurrency venture." Jason's head jerked up. "That was your idea, Dad." "Shut up," my father snapped. Rosa spoke next, tapping her laptop screen so the numbers lit up in neat, damning columns. "And here," she said, "is the $200,000 company loan you took in 2012 to buy your Aspen vacation home, a loan you never repaid. Your parents could have taken legal action, but didn't. That generosity is now documented." Aunt Pam leaned forward, bristling. "This is all irrelevant. Our parents." Judge Henderson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Davis, I've reviewed the video journals your mother kept. This is entirely relevant. And those journals leave no doubt that these decisions were made without influence from anyone but themselves." Pam's mouth snapped shut, but the flush in her cheeks deepened. Chief Williams, who had been silent until now, rested her hand lightly on the back of an empty chair. "I'll also point out that the property is under 24-hour video surveillance," she said. "Any attempt to remove items without permission constitutes theft, and I don't need to tell you what happens when theft is recorded on multiple cameras." Carlos stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The system backs up to secure cloud storage every 30 minutes. For the first time, my mother shifted uncomfortably. Jason's gaze flicked to the window, like he was considering the nearest exit. I watched all of it from my place in the center, my pulse steady. This wasn't bluster anymore. This was evidence, authority, and witnesses. The three things my family never thrived under. And we were just getting started. Matthew reached into the thick folder he'd brought and pulled out several large envelopes, each sealed and labeled with a family member's name in block letters. "I've prepared documentation for each of you," he said, his tone polite but without the slightest trace of deference. "Inside, you'll find a summary of the evidence presented here today, along with additional records your parents compiled over the years. If you choose to contest the will, all of it will become part of the public record." He handed them out one by one. Jason snatched his and flipped it open, scanning a few pages before his face darkened. Aunt Pam took hers with stiff fingers, muttering under her breath. My father didn't even open his, just set it on the arm of his chair like it was a prop in a play he refused to acknowledge. I stepped forward then, holding a smaller stack of papers. My palms were dry. My voice was steady. "These," I said, placing the first set in front of Jason, "are cease and desist orders addressing the threats you've made to me." His smirk twitched, but he didn't speak. I slid the next set toward my father. "These are notices that I'm aware of the items removed from this house after the funeral and expect their immediate return. If they're not back within 72 hours, I'll take formal action." He leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening, but still said nothing. Finally, I handed my mother a single-page document. "And this," I said, "outlines the terms under which I'm willing to maintain any kind of relationship with you moving forward. They include respect for my grandparents' wishes and an immediate end to all attempts to contest the will." The silence was sharp enough to cut. My family was used to me sitting quietly, absorbing whatever they threw my way. They weren't prepared for me to draw lines, and they definitely weren't prepared for me to have the law, the evidence, and half a dozen witnesses standing at my back when I did it. Aunt Pam broke first. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising. "You've poisoned this family against us. You think you're better than—" "Pamela," Judge Henderson interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel strike. "I suggest you read the contents of your envelope before making any more statements. You may find your position unsustainable." For the first time since walking into this house, I saw something I'd never seen in my family's eyes when dealing with me: hesitation. And that hesitation felt like the first step toward them finally understanding I wasn't going to bend. It was Uncle Steve who cracked first. He'd been silent the entire time, head down, flipping through the papers in his envelope. Now, he reached over and touched Aunt Pam's arm. "We should go," he murmured. "This isn't a fight we can win." She jerked her arm away. "Don't tell me—" "Pam," he said again, firmer this time. "Read it, all of it. Then tell me you still want to walk into court with this hanging over us." Across the table, my father finally opened his envelope. He scanned a few pages, stopped, went back, and read more slowly. His face changed. Not embarrassment, not shame, but the cold calculation of someone realizing the odds had shifted permanently. "This is not over," he said, looking at me, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "Actually, Richard, it is," Judge Henderson said, his tone final. "Your parents were meticulous. Their documentation is ironclad. No judge in this county would overturn their wishes based on what I've seen here today." Jason pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped the floor. "This is a setup," he muttered. "All of you are in on it." "Or," Rosa said mildly, "we've just been paying attention while you weren't." The quiet after that was different. It wasn't the tense, crackling silence from earlier. It was the sound of people realizing they'd lost and were deciding how to leave with whatever dignity they could salvage. One by one they stood. Aunt Pam's heels clicked angrily toward the door, Uncle Steve trailing after her. Jason stalked out next, not looking at me, his shoulders rigid. My mother followed, chin high, eyes darting everywhere but my face. My father lingered just a moment longer, gaze sweeping the room. "You think you've won something here," he said, "but you'll find out soon enough that you're alone." He turned and walked out without waiting for a reply. The sound of their cars starting in the driveway was loud in the sudden stillness. Dorothy moved first, setting a tray of fresh coffee and pastries on the table as though she were clearing away the taste of something bitter. The others gathered around me, their voices warm, reassuring. I tried to smile, to match their relief, but the truth was, the victory felt hollow. I had protected my grandparents' wishes, I had stood my ground, but the family I'd been born into had just walked out the door, and I knew they wouldn't be back. 6 months passed in a blur of paperwork, signatures, and 1,000 small decisions that seemed to matter more because they weren't just about money. They were about carrying something forward. The first weeks were the hardest. My phone would buzz with half-hearted reconciliation attempts from my family, all of them conveniently timed around some new problem they wanted me to solve. My father hinted at short-term loans to help with his company's cash flow. My mother suggested she could advise on charitable giving if I'd give her a seat on the foundation's board. Jason sent a one-line email. "Need startup capital. We'll give you a cut when it blows up big." I sent the same reply every time. "Please refer to the terms I gave you. I'm not changing them." They never met those terms. With Matthew's guidance, I formally launched the Elizabeth and Harold Alexander Foundation for Education, seeded with $10 million from the estate. It focused on underfunded schools, arts programs, and vocational training, the things my grandparents had quietly supported for decades without ever chasing credit. I kept my job at Sunshine Elementary, despite the raised eyebrows from people who thought someone with money like that wouldn't work another day in their life. I didn't care. My classroom became a little oasis. New books, fresh art supplies, working technology, healthy snacks. I paid for winter coats when a child needed one, no questions asked. Small expenses for me, huge changes for them. Rosa mentored me through the basics of the logistics business. I wasn't interested in running Alexander Logistics day to day, but I wanted to ensure it stayed aligned with my grandparents' values. Profit sharing for employees, strong retirement benefits, and a company culture that felt more like a family than the one I'd been born into. The house, once painfully silent, began to feel alive again. Carlos tended the grounds like always, and Dorothy came by 3 times a week, stubbornly refusing to fully retire. We opened the basement for community events, tutoring sessions, and small foundation gatherings. Sunday dinners became a tradition again, but with a different guest list. Rosa, Matthew, Carlos and his family, Dorothy, neighbors who'd known my grandparents for years. These weren't people tied to me by blood. They were tied by choice, respect, and genuine care. It wasn't the family I'd lost, but maybe it was the one I was meant to have all along. It was a crisp autumn morning when I finally went, the kind where the air feels clean in your lungs and the trees are letting go of their leaves one by one, gold and amber drifting to the ground. I parked at the edge of the cemetery and walked the winding path, bouquet in hand, dahlias and marigolds, Grandma's favorites. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound. Their headstone was simple, just names, dates, and the words, "Built with integrity, loved with purpose." I knelt to clear away a few stray leaves, then set the flowers in the small bronze vase at the base. For months, I'd avoided this moment, telling myself I was too busy with the foundation, with the house, with the business. The truth was simpler. I didn't know if I could stand here without falling apart. But now I found myself speaking out loud. I'm trying my best to honor what you built, I said, my voice sounding strange in the quiet. The foundation's already given 3 full scholarships to students who never thought college was possible. Your employees still talk about you like you were family. A soft breeze stirred the trees, sending a few leaves spiraling down onto the grass. I wish you could see it all, I went on. The Sunday dinners, the garden, Carlos still polishing the banisters like Grandpa taught him, Dorothy still baking your lemon bars. I understand now why you made the choice you did. It wasn't about the money. It was about making sure the right person could keep your values alive. I thought about the anonymous donations I'd uncovered over the last few months. Medical bills quietly paid, mortgages saved from foreclosure, tuition covered for children whose parents couldn't afford it. None of it done for recognition. All of it done because it was right. A lump rose in my throat, but it wasn't the same sharp grief from the funeral. This felt different. Heavier, yes, but steadier. Thank you for trusting me, I whispered. I won't let you down. For a while, I just sat there, letting the silence settle around me. When I finally stood, I felt lighter. Not because the weight was gone, but because I knew I could carry it. The Foundation's first scholarship ceremony was held in late spring, the kind of day when the air smells faintly of cut grass and possibility. We'd set up in the renovated community space in my grandparents' basement, rows of folding chairs, a small stage, and a banner that read, Elizabeth and Harold Alexander Foundation, Investing in the Future. 20 students sat in the front row, each with a name tag and a folder containing their scholarship award letter. They were nervous, excited, their parents and siblings packed into the seats behind them. I stood at the podium, scanning their faces. They reminded me of myself at 17, hopeful but not entirely convinced the world would open its doors for them. Today isn't just about money, I told them. It's about possibility. My grandparents believed that resources should be used to create opportunities, not just to measure status. They built their lives on that idea. These scholarships are meant to carry that forward, not just for you, but for everyone you'll go on to help. One by one, we called them up. Maria Vasquez, a bright-eyed senior who wanted to become a teacher. Jamal Harris, already designing prototypes for affordable water filtration systems. Emily Tran, a gifted pianist who'd been practicing on a secondhand keyboard with 2 broken keys. When Maria came up, she hugged me before taking her folder. No one in my family has ever gone to college, she whispered. This changes everything. And in that moment, I felt my grandparents so clearly, it was almost as if they were in the room, Grandma beaming, Grandpa nodding with quiet pride. The applause, the smiles, the camera flashes, it wasn't about me. It was about a ripple effect they had started decades ago, one I now had the privilege to keep moving. As the last student took their seat, I glanced toward the back of the room. Matthew was standing there with Rosa and Carlos, all 3 watching, like they'd known this was exactly where I was supposed to end up. And maybe they were right. That evening, after the ceremony, the house was full again. Not with the people who had walked out months ago, but with the ones who had stayed, or stepped in when they didn't have to. Dorothy had outdone herself with a spread that would have made my grandmother proud. Roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie, cooling on the counter. Carlos uncorked a bottle of wine from the cellar, one my grandfather had been saving for a special occasion. We crowded around the dining table, Rosa telling a story about the early days of the company, Matthew laughing at something George had said, the scholarship recipients who'd come with their families lingering in the living room, reluctant to leave. It struck me then, this wasn't just a dinner. This was my family now. Not the one bound by blood, but the one bound by choice, by respect, by shared values. I thought about the empty place my parents and brother had left behind. The truth was, their absence didn't hurt the way it used to. Maybe because I'd stopped expecting them to be people they'd never been. Maybe because the space they vacated had been filled by people who actually cared if I was okay. After dessert, I slipped out to the porch for a moment of quiet. The garden was lit softly by the string lights Grandpa had hung years ago, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Inside, I could hear laughter spilling down the hallway. I realized then that my grandparents had given me more than an inheritance. They'd given me the blueprint for building a life worth living, and the freedom to choose who I wanted beside me while I did it. Would my old family ever try to come back? Probably. And maybe one day I'd decide whether there was a place for them here, but I knew now that whether they came back or not, I'd be fine, because I already had a family. Months later, I still caught myself reaching for the phone to call my grandparents, to tell them about a meeting that went well or a student who'd made a breakthrough. The ache was still there, but it had softened into something I could carry. The foundation was thriving. The first group of scholarship students were sending updates. Maria emailed photos from her college campus. Jamal sent blueprints for his next prototype. Emily invited me to her first recital on a real piano. Alexander Logistics continued to operate in the spirit my grandparents had built it on, thanks to Rosa's steady leadership and the profit-sharing model that kept employees invested not just in their work, but in each other. The house had become a hub for community meetings, foundation events, or just quiet Sunday dinners where people lingered long after the plates were cleared. It was alive again. One Saturday morning, I found myself in the garden, pruning the rose bushes with the same shears Grandpa had used. Carlos was fixing the porch railing, humming under his breath, and Dorothy was inside baking lemon bars. The air smelled like cut grass and sugar. And it hit me. This was the legacy. Not the money, not even the property, but the ability to create something steady and good, to choose how it grew and who it grew with. Money can reveal true colors, and my family had shown theirs in stark detail. But it had also revealed something else, a network of people who had loved my grandparents for who they were, not for what they owned, people who, in turn, now cared about me. That was the real inheritance, and no one could contest it. Late one evening, months after the confrontation, I walked out onto the back porch with a mug of tea. The garden stretched out before me, lit by the same string lights Grandpa had hung years ago. Their warm glow cast soft halos over the rows of vegetables, the trimmed hedges, the roses just starting to bloom again. Inside, I could hear laughter. Dorothy teasing Carlos about his terrible whistling, Rosa telling Matthew about a shipping deal that reminded her of Grandpa's first big contract. The clink of plates and the low hum of voices layered together into something that felt like home. I sat down on the porch steps, letting the cool night air brush against my skin. For a long moment, I just listened. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be here, not just in this house, but in this life, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I thought family meant the people you were born to. I thought keeping the peace was the only way to keep them. Now I knew better. Family was the people who showed up without asking for anything in return, the ones who stayed when there was nothing to gain but connection, the ones who fought beside you because they believed in what you were protecting. The mug was warm in my hands, the night quiet except for the occasional burst of laughter drifting out from the kitchen. Somewhere in the trees beyond the garden, a night bird called. I took a slow sip of tea and let the calm settle over me. My grandparents' voices lived on here, in the way the light swayed gently in the breeze, in the smell of fresh earth, in the rhythm of people gathered around a table. Their legacy was safe. Their trust had not been misplaced. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The fight was over. The life was mine. Fade out. Completed.